Hey, good morning or good afternoon, fourth grade, depending on what time you are watching this video. Today, we are going to get started on annotating the text from the DCPS packet for week one. The text we are annotating today is The Daughters of Liberty text, which is a play. And so if you haven't watched Miss Rose read aloud of this play, please stop the video here, head over to her channel and watch the video, and then come back, and then we'll go through annotating the text together. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. All righty, so start this from the beginning. There we go. All right, so just as a reminder, there's a few things that we want to make sure that we're including in our annotations. So we want to make sure that we are underlining all major points, so anything that's super important. We want to circle any important keywords or phrases that may be confusing or we may not know. The third thing we want to include are question marks. Maybe there's a question that you have while you're reading. Put a question mark and you can write that question over in the margin of the text. And lastly, margin notes. And those are just clarifying statements that you can write over in the margins as well. And that I like to think of those as kind of like really short summaries of a short section that you just read. So those are the things that we're going to be using today to annotate this text. All right. These are the 4 questions that you guys wrote with Ms. Johnston yesterday. And so these are the 4 questions we're going to be using to kind of guide our annotations today. So these are kind of the things we are looking for. These are the questions that we're going to look for evidence for in the text as we read, okay? The first one that you guys came up with was, why were women supporting the cause of freedom? The second question is, what did women do to make things better in America? The third thing is, how did women help the American colonies during the Revolution? And lastly, we're going to be answering, where in the colonies did women support freedom? So let's start with the first question. Why were women supporting the cause of freedom? We're going to take a look in Act 1, Scene 1 of the play. This is where we're going to be able to extract a lot of information or a lot of evidence to answer this question. So if we take a look closely, the first piece of evidence that we find is actually midway through Scene 1, and we see the character Patsy Blair. She says, "We think the colonies should build their own factories and produce their own furniture and books and cloth." It blatantly points out one reason why they were supporting the cause of freedom. They wanted to be able to produce their own goods in the colonies and not have to depend on English or English trade. The second thing, if we keep reading, Patsy Blair, the same character we just discussed, she also says, we want to create jobs here in the colonies. We want to keep our money and business here. So that was another reason why they wanted to be free from England. They wanted to create jobs in the colonies. Thirdly, the character Helen Dixon says, we've come here today to spin our own cloth, to show people that we don't need to depend on England to supply us with the things we need. So I want you to underline this quote from Helen Dixon, but I also want you to circle the word depend. This is going to be a very important vocabulary word, depend, because that's exactly what was happening at this time. They were depending on England for all of their goods and all of their products. And so they were trying to move away from that. So the word depend is very important in this text. Next, back to Patsy Blair. She also says that you ask us to pay too high a price for English silk. So not only were they having to depend on the English for their goods, the English were also charging them a ridiculous amount for these things. So these were some of the reasons why the women were supporting the cause of freedom. They wanted to move away from being under the British control. Lastly, on this page, Helen Dixon, the other character we discussed, she says, "Not until we're free to produce cloth here or buy it from any country we choose. It's not a matter of money, it's a matter of liberty." That's that line that I just read. That's the one that I really want you to focus in on. It's not a matter of money, it's a matter of liberty. So for the ladies of the colonies, they weren't really focused on the money aspect. It was more about just having their own freedom, okay? The last thing we're gonna add to our annotations, well, a couple more things. I want you to circle the word liberty. Liberty means freedom. And so that's what these women were fighting for throughout this entire text. Lastly, on this page, I want you to add this small summary over in the margin. Didn't like being under the control of England. That's basically what this fight was all about. This is why they supported the cause of freedom. They didn't like being under the control of England. So I want you to add that at the top of your page or over in the margins, wherever you can fit it. All right. So this is some evidence that answers our first question. If we go to the next page, which starts Act 2, there's also a little bit of evidence here that answers that question, why were women supporting the cause of freedom? The first thing we find is actually from the narrator. The narrator starts off by saying, in addition to controlling trade in the colonies, England wanted the colonists to pay taxes on certain goods. And in 1765, England passed the Stamp Act. And so this is something that the ladies were fighting against. They did not like the Stamp Act because they basically had to pay tax on specific goods that they needed. I also want you to go ahead and circle the word Stamp Act. That's going to be a very important vocabulary word. Next, one of the characters, Abigail Good, she says, "We have no voice in Parliament. We pay taxes, yet we have no one to speak for us in the English government." So this was another reason why they were supporting freedom. They were being forced to pay taxes, but yet they had no representation. There was no one in the British government to speak up for them. Go ahead and circle that word Parliament. Parliament is just the British form of government. And then the second word I want you to circle is representation, because they did not have that in the British government. The next thing that points to evidence as to why they were supporting freedom, the character India Bradford says, "The Stamp Act is unfair." And that's basically what we've been discussing with the last two pieces of evidence. They thought it was unfair. They were being taxed on certain goods that they needed. And then lastly, I want you to add in your margin notes, just a quick summary that they were being taxed without having a voice in government. So go ahead and add that either at the top or wherever you can fit it in your margins. So this pretty much answers our first question: why were women supporting the cause of freedom? We've gathered lots of evidence for it. So make sure you go back, make sure you've underlined everything that we've underlined, make sure you circle those important vocabulary words, make sure you add the margin notes that we added, okay? All right, you guys ready to move on? All right, so let's move on to the second question. What did women do to make things better in America? 1 second, there we go. So the first thing that we find, the narrator the narrator explains to us that these women that were fighting for freedom, they formed a group called the Daughters of Liberty. So that was kind of their first step in the right direction of standing up for themselves, standing up for other colonists. They formed this group to basically go out and start to speak up for the things that they thought were unfair. Also, go ahead and circle the phrase Daughters of Liberty. That was the name of their group. The next thing that these ladies did to kind of make things better, they started having these discussions about what to do about this Stamp Act that they did not like. And Abigail Good, she suggested destroying the stamps. So that's something that they discussed doing to kind of make things better in America, to kind of get rid of the Stamp Act. For the margin notes, I'm going to add that they formed Daughters of Liberty and decided to protest the Stamp Act. All right, let's move on to the next page. All right, we're still on question number 2. What did women do to make things better in America? When we go over to Act 3, there's also a few things here that we can use as evidence to answer this question. The first thing is the narrator says, thanks to the resistance of the Daughters and Sons of Liberty, the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766. Circle the word resistance and circle the word repealed. First, we want to point out the fact that after they formed this group, one of the first things they did was they basically started to protest. And their protest, or their resistance, their refusal to pay the Stamp Act actually led to the Stamp Act being repealed or being done away with. So they finally got rid of it in 1766. And then I just added that to my margin notes. Resistance led to the repeal of the Stamp Act. And once again, resistance means like a protest or a refusal to do something. And then repeal is kind of getting rid of something. All right, now we're ready to move on to question number 3, guys. How did women help the American colonies during the Revolution? So we're looking for the things that they did. How did they help the American colonies? The first thing that we find, the character Abigail Good, she says, when the stamps arrive from England, send them back or take them and make sure they're not sold. So this was an idea they came up with, and when the ships did arrive in England, they tried to send them back. They also took them with them to make sure that they weren't sold throughout the colony. Also in Act 3, we find that they actually did go through with it. They said, we'll meet the British ship coming into our harbor and demand the stamps. Pass the word on to other daughters and sons. So not only did they demand the stamps from the British ships, they started to pass this word on to other people in the colonies to let them know that this is what they were doing. Circle that word demand. So they didn't go and ask for them. They demanded the stamps from the British ships that came in. So they kind of did it in a forceful way. We also find the character Maud Epperson. She says, I propose that we send the Declaration to the Daughters of Liberty in all the colonies so they may pass it around. So they actually made a declaration, and they wanted to spread that declaration to other people in the colonies to let them know that this was their plan. This is what they had agreed to do as, as American colonists. Circle that word declaration. A declaration is kind of like a statement saying, this is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to agree to. So the actual declaration that they made comes from Elizabeth King. And she says, give up the custom of drinking tea, and we promise not to wear any cloth or clothing made in England. So they basically were refusing, they were declaring that they were going to refuse to use any products or any goods that came from England. All right. So these were all the things that the women did to help American colonies during the Revolution. There's one more thing that we want to point out here. The narrator on the last page, this is actually my favorite part of this play. The women discover that there are some merchants, one in particular, Mr. Thomas Boylston, that has basically been keeping goods that they have, and he is overcharging colonists. So basically, he has coffee that has not been sold or given out before the harbor was closed. And so now, since he's the only person that has coffee in this community, he is now overcharging the colonists. And so the Daughters of Liberty they have decided to stand against this. And so they go out, they confront him, and they actually end up basically kind of forcing him to give them his key. They go into the warehouse and they get all of the coffee out so that people can have it fairly. And in my margin notes, I just summarized that whole thing. I said that they took goods from merchants who overcharged. Okay. All right, and so this brings us to our very last question: where in the colonies did women support freedom? This was the easiest question, I feel like, to answer, because at the beginning of each act of the play, they list the location of where these women where the women were and where they were kind of doing these things like protesting. So in Act 1, the location is Boston Commons. This is in the city of Boston, Massachusetts, okay? The second location where they were supporting freedom was Providence, Rhode Island. This is the location of the second act of the play. The third act of the play takes place in Eddington, North Carolina. So this is another location where the women were supporting freedom. And lastly, Griffin's Wharf on Boston Harbor. So this was the last location of where the women were supporting freedom. Okay. All right. So these 4 locations should be underlined as well. And I think that brings us to the end of our annotations there. Okay. All right, guys. So if I move too fast for you guys, you can go back through, pause the video on each slide so that you can see everything that we underlined. You can see all of our margin notes. And so hold on to those annotations, because you'll need them for when we start the final writing project. All right. All right, guys, I'll see you later.